Hey, welcome back to the Deeper Bible Podcast. We're continuing our exploration of the book of Revelation, and today we're coming to one of its most well-known sections, chapters 2 and 3. Jesus speaks to 7 churches in the first century. And in last episode, we got a glimpse of how John saw Jesus, not Jesus the peasant walking through Galilean villages, but megawatt Jesus, Jesus who's brighter than the sun, who's makes you fall down before him as though dead. And now in Revelation chapter 2, that very Jesus is going to be addressing 7 specific churches in the first century. We know all sorts of archaeological information about these places and how targeted Jesus's words are to each location. He's going to have 3 main things to say to each of these 7 churches. He's going to say, here's what you're doing right. I affirm that. I'm praising that. He's going to say, here's what you're doing wrong. Here's where you're in danger and what's going to happen if you don't fix it. And third, here's a promise. Here's motivation to continue to endure because if you keep the end game in view, that will help you have the grit and the spiritual tenacity to get through. So sitting with Lindsay.
Hey.
And let's do some Bible, huh?
Okay. So we're going to be talking about these 7 churches. Right. So we can ask, why 7? Well, these were very real churches facing real things in these real times. And as you guys discussed last time, 7 is like a number of completion,
right? And
so it is finished. It's relative to us today to learn from these 7 churches. Yeah,
yeah. You know, I just learned actually the other day that Paul in the New Testament, Paul also writes to 7 churches, and maybe he wrote to more, but the early Christians are very attuned to the symbolism of numbers, and so they're saying 7 stands in for the entirety. And also not just then for the entirety of the church then, but for the church today as well. So, the word of God is still speaking today, but doing the homework to understand the sharp edge of what was being said then is the on-ramp to understanding what Jesus is saying to us today.
Yeah.
So.
Man, okay.
All right.
This is exciting. So we're going to be talking about these 7 churches. Before we get into the specifics of each church, what is the big picture? Can you give us a little bit of a roadmap of?
Yes. So as in so much of the Bible and Revelation in particular, genre is very important. And in chapters 2 and 3 of Revelation, it's almost like a genre within a genre.
Okay.
In the second episode of this series, we talked about how Revelation has 3 genres. It's a letter, it's apocalyptic, and it's also a prophecy. And apocalypse and prophecy relate in a certain way. Apocalyptic is a type of prophecy. But anyways, now we're looking at the form of a letter, and there are antecedents or earlier models of what we find in Revelation 2 and 3. We find in the Old Testament. So we find things like God has warnings to the people of Israel of hey, here's where you're going off the rails. And it's framed as a covenant lawsuit. God is saying, I'm taking you to court because you've been so unfaithful to me. We also get prophetic letters in the Old Testament. Jeremiah does this. Amos does this. And then in the first century, also it's common for rhetoricians to be very strategic in how they mix praise with accusation. Because if you come in and just slam somebody, they're not going to listen.
Right.
It's the old sandwich method.
Right.
When somebody shows up to me and they start by a compliment, I'm like, oh, crap.
No,
Here it comes. Yeah, thank you. I'm glad. Just what's the problem?
That's so true.
We got some of the sandwich method.
Yeah.
And also imperial edicts. The emperor would send off a note to some city and they'd pin it up. So there's overlapping genres in the background that would have maybe been recognized in the first century. Now, each of these 7 letters is unique, but they have a common structure. So they Destiny and I were using this phrase a couple episodes ago called Janus-faced.
Okay. Yes.
Janus, was the Roman god of doors.
Yep.
Goddess. God or goddess? I think a goddess.
I don't know.
I hope so. Fact check.
Okay.
And the face looked 2 directions. And just so, each of these little letters is Janus-faced in that the opening of each letter looks backward to the vision of Jesus in Revelation 1. And so it picks up details from there. Thus says the one whose legs are like bronze. Thus says the one whose eyes are fire. Thus says the one with the keys of David and the stars in his hand. So it's looking back, but it's also looking forward because the promise that Jesus gives to each of the churches is fulfilled in the New Jerusalem, the new heavens and the new earth at the end of the book of Revelation.
Right.
And so it's looking both ways, and it sets up the narrative tension of the book, which is, are these churches and the people in them going to be able to endure faithfully all the way to the end? Because between the letters and the New Jerusalem, there's a lot of stuff.
Yes.
So it's motivation to continue. And then, as we said, there's these three components. There's praise. Here's what you're doing great. Except for the Church of Laodicea, the final one gets no praise.
Right.
They're just a mess. They're lukewarm, and we'll talk about that.
Yep.
The second thing is rebuke. Here's what you're doing wrong. And all the churches are rebuked except two. Smyrna and Philadelphia get off the hook.
Okay.
And Jesus is a faithful friend. Friends tell each other the truth. He's going to frankly tell them, here's where you are. You're out of line. And he's not just a friend, he's a Lord. So he will punish, not to destroy them, but to help them come back to their senses and live under the lordship of Jesus in a good way. So there's that. And then there's then these promises. So we'll try to look for those three things as we go through each letter. A couple more little points. Ancient cities, maybe more than today, there was a lot of local pride, sort of hometown pride.
Yeah.
And so when Jesus sprinkles in local color, he's activating that sort of civic pride and the backstory of each city in a way that really spoke to them then.
Okay.
So we'll see how that works. Okay. But the point I'm trying to make is that people were really proud of their hometown.
Yeah.
And so when Jesus is making these allusions, he's speaking their language in a way.
Okay.
Do you have a question about that?
No, I try to think of analogies, and so I'm like, if you were to go to like Alabama and be like,
oh yeah, totally,
like speaking in in a way that they would kind of get and want to listen.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's amazing. I mean, even in America,
like a college campus. I don't know.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's a thing. But like growing up in Montana.
Yeah.
There's a lot of Montana pride, and especially if you're native born.
Yeah.
Like if you moved to Montana when you were 3 and you lived there, but you're not born in Montana. You don't count. And you are like the worst if you moved to California.
Oh, yes.
They think we're terrible. They think we're just crazy. And like my little nephew, if he wears like a Golden State Warriors jersey in Montana, like at the grocery store, people will like be jerks. I mean, it's really, bummer. It's low ball sometimes.
Right.
Funny. One of the things is about this is, people are often, rightly so, kind of discouraged about the church and the people you find in there. Why do Christians act this way? Mm-hmm. But you know what? Throughout the whole Old Testament, the people of Israel was struggling.
Yeah.
Throughout the whole New Testament, the church was a shenanigan.
Yeah.
And turns out that the people of God and that the household of God has never been all swept and ordered and put together in a showroom. It's always been a messy family room. Mm-hmm. It's lived in. Mm-hmm. And so that is as true today as it was in the first century. Right. If the church wasn't a mess, we wouldn't even have the New Testament because Paul wouldn't have written these letters. Right. He wouldn't have written Corinth. He'd have just said, carry on, you're doing great. Mm-hmm. But he had more to say.
Yeah.
So there's that reality. Last thing I'll say that's interesting, each of the 7 letters ends with a statement Jesus was fond of in his ministry. Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. And Eugene Peterson comments, he says that the church is a listening post. Mm-hmm. When we're at church, we need to cock our ears to heaven to say, what is the Spirit saying to us? What is Jesus saying to us? And that's something I think we can keep in the background as we go through each of these letters.
Yeah, it's helpful that it's repetitive, so we're reminded each time.
Yeah.
Hey, what can we learn from this?
Yeah. So here's how we're going to do it. We're going to read each letter, and then we'll notice a few things, history, literature, theology, application, and then we'll go to the next letter.
Yep, and we are going to be reading the actual text also.
Yeah.
What version are this?
Yeah. We're using the New Testament for everyone.
Yeah.
This is N.T. Wright's translation. or NT wrong, but I think he's NT right. I'm sure he's never heard that. So do you want to read us the first one?
And we're going to start in chapter 2?
Yep.
Okay. Here we go. Letter to Ephesus. Write this to the angel of the church in Ephesus. These are the words of the one who holds the 7 stars in his right hand and who walks in among the 7 golden lampstands. I know what you have done, your hard labor and patience. I know that you cannot tolerate evil people and that you have tested those who pass themselves off as apostles but are not, and you have demonstrated them to be frauds. You have patience and you have put up with a great deal because of my name, and you haven't grown weary. I do, however, have one thing against you. You have abandoned the love you showed at the beginning. So remember the place from which you have fallen. Repent and do the works you did at the beginning. If not, if you don't repent, I will come and remove your lampstand out of its place. You do, though, have this in your favor. You hate what the Nicolaitans are doing, and I hate it too. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. The tree of life stands in God's paradise, and I will give the right to eat from it to anyone who conquers it.
So a little bit of background here. The city of Ephesus was typical first century Roman city, things like major temples. It had a temple to Artemis, which was like one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was a center of emperor worship. And so right out of the gate, Jesus is framed in opposition to these Roman gods and rulers and say, no, he holds the stars. He holds the course of the universe in his hand. So it's not just nice imagery. It's making a counterclaim about how reality is structured. This church has a common problem for Christians. Their mind is in the right place. They've got doctrinal vigilance. They don't put up with bad teaching and stuff, but their hearts are in the wrong place. So they don't bring in these Nicolaitans. And there's been all sorts of scholarly research to try to figure out who are these people. There's no clear answer to that.
Okay,
but
that was going to be one of my questions.
Yeah, it's one of my questions too. And
who are these people?
Dug up, and so different possible answers have been put forward.
Okay.
The basic gist seems to be these are people who are encouraging compromise with the imperial system. And on a variety of fronts, and this theme will come up in subsequent letters, and he will use names like they're Balaam, they're Jezebel, they're and they're all kind of pointing to the same reality of the siren song of people saying, you can have one foot in Jesus and the church and one foot in Rome and that system, and that'll be great. And Revelation is saying, no, you cannot do that. But it's not just about the mind. It's about the heart. He says, I have one thing against you. You've turned off your first love. And who is that love of? Is it love of God?
Right.
Is it love of each other? Is it love of neighbor? We don't know.
Okay.
Could be any of those. But it's important to remember for the early Christians, love wasn't just an emotion, sort of like, well, I've lost the fuzzies. It was something you do. It was pragmatic care for the hungry, for the naked, for the imprisoned, for the poor. And he's saying, you guys you've gotten too comfortable. You've gotten married to your convenience. And Jesus is saying, I don't like that.
Right.
And if you don't shape up, I'm going to come and remove your lampstand.
Yeah, what is that? What does lampstand mean?
Yeah, so remember in Revelation 1, John's initial vision, he sees 7 lamps, or a lampstand was set like a candelabra, like there was in the ancient temple, the Jewish temple. And Jesus is walking among them. And then Jesus gives the interpretation at the end of chapter 1. He says, by the way, those 7 golden lampstands, that's the 7 churches. Now, it's interesting that while Ephesus was a real center for the early church, in fact, one of the major church councils was held in Ephesus. But my understanding is there's no churches there today. Like their lampstand has been removed.
They've lost their influence, their position, their being.
Yeah. So it's interesting from an historical standpoint. I don't know if you can draw a connection between like sort of the spirituality of the first century and what's there today, but Western Turkey, which is Asia Minor, which is this area, is certainly not a powerhouse of Christianity today, that's for sure. By the way, let's look at the map real quick, just so that we have, and we'll throw it up on the screen here. So there's these 7 churches, and this is a sort of a circular letter. So Patmos is here on the left, and Ephesus is the nearest big city. It'll go first to Ephesus, then up the coast to Smyrna, Pergamum, down to Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and end in Laodicea.
Clockwise.
Which is right near, Laodicea is right near Colossae. So where the...
Colossians.
Yes, that's right. So Paul wrote Colossians to them. But at the end of Colossians, it says, by the way, pass this on to the people up the road in Laodicea.
Because they're next door.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, Paul spent a couple years in Ephesus. So this was a real hub of the early church.
Okay.
And you can go to each of these sites, and a lot of the different local color in the letters you can see and be like, oh, that's where the throne of Satan was, and all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
So,
all right.
So yeah, I think the upshot for the first letter is be sure you don't have a right mind but a wrong heart.
Yes.
And
okay.
So let's read the next one.
Okay, Smyrna.
Yep.
We're going on to Smyrna. Okay. So we're continuing chapter 2, verse 8. The letter to Smyrna. Write this to the angel of the church in Smyrna. These are the words of the first and the last, the one who was dead and came to life. I know you're suffering and poverty, but you are rich. I know the blasphemy of those self-styled Jews. They are nothing of the kind. They are a Satan synagogue. Don't be afraid of what you're going to suffer. Look, the devil is going to throw some of you into prison so that you may be put to the test. You will have 10 days of affliction. Be faithful all the way to death, and I will give you the crown of life. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. The second death will not harm the one who conquers.
All right, so Smyrna is in the modern Turkish city of Izmir, and it's a major port city and very wealthy, although apparently some of the Christians were excluded from that. The Christians were having a hard time. That's where he says, I know that you're suffering, you're poor and all this stuff, but you are rich, because somehow that earthly persecution brings out spiritual riches from them. Now, this is the first time we encounter this antagonism that comes up in several letters where John is writing about self-styled Jews, the Satan synagogue, all this kind of stuff. And that's kind of like, whoa, what's he talking about? So it's important to remember, in the first century, there were several Jewish renewal movements. Like, the historian Josephus gives us a snapshot of different groups: the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes, who were the guys writing the Dead Sea Scrolls down in the desert in Qumran, the Fourth Philosophy, or the Zealots, or the Sicarii, the men of the dagger. And so there was an intra-Jewish debate within Judaism saying, who are the real Jews here? Who can say we are children of Abraham, we keep the Torah as it was meant to be? And so it's important when we see things, when we see the New Testament critiquing the Jews, who's writing it? The Jews. So this is not against Judaism. This is not a model for how Christians should relate to Jews.
Okay.
And tragically, it often has been. These kinds of things have underwritten a lot of anti-Semitism over the last 2,000 years.
Yeah.
So that's wrong, but it's also wrong to say, oh, we can't touch that, we better blunt the criticism. We do need to know what that criticism is and why did Jesus make it may not be politically correct today, but Jesus made a very strong claim. This is the right way, that is the wrong way. And yes, the people on the wrong way say they're on the right way, but they are incorrect. I remember one time in grad school, we had a physicist come and talk to the Christian group, and he goes, I think it's a lot easier to be a Christian in a physics department than it is in like a religion department, because physicists still believe there's a fundamental difference between right and wrong. Like, here's the question, here's the problem, run the numbers, there is one right answer.
Right.
And there's not, I don't care how much your heart was in it. If you are wrong, you are wrong, do it again.
Right.
But we live in a culture where to say, I have the truth and you don't have the truth, that's like, well, you probably shouldn't say that. Yeah. But the real world does have those kinds of binaries, God forbid, right and wrong. So anyways, the word Satan in Hebrew, hasatan, means at its most basic level, the accuser.
Okay.
Remember in the book of Job when we were taken into the heavenly court and here comes Hasatan.
Yep.
And what's he doing? He's accusing Job.
Right.
Oh, that guy's only behaving well because he gets so much good stuff from you.
Yeah.
But take away the goods, he's accuser. And so when this, with the Jewish group here in Smyrna, is called the Satan synagogue, it's not just some sort
It's very intense.
It's not it's not just a slur like, oh, you wicked satanic people.
Yes.
It's using the word properly, which is to say the Christians in the early church were often accused either by the Jewish community or their pagan neighbors as being social deviants. Let me explain that just a little bit more. So the Jewish people in the Roman Empire had special privileges that they did not have to participate in certain civic religion stuff. Like the Romans realized, okay, the Jewish people really don't want to worship Caesar. They will fight us over it. They will die over it. What's the big deal? We'll just give them an exemption.
Okay.
And because the Christians were seen as Jews, okay, a Jewish splinter movement, but they're Jews. They get that same pass. But if Jews are saying they're not part of us, now the Christians have come out from under the protection of the law.
Got it.
And it's important to see, remember in the Old Testament, the exile happens. Why? Because the people of Israel didn't keep the covenant. Does that mean every single individual Jew was wicked? No, probably not. But this is hard for us to understand in our Western individualized culture where we're like, well, I did right, so God will relate right to me. But in much of the world of ancient times and still today, in much of the eastern part of the world, society is a collective. What you do reflects on me. What I do reflects on you. We share consequences. We share a fate. So when Christians said, I'm not worshiping Caesar, I'm not worshiping Artemis and all these other gods, I'm not doing it. The response of citizens wasn't like, hey, you do you, that's great. The response was, you're putting all of us in danger. The God will not protect us because you are a social rebel. And so there was this huge pressure to say like, no, you will be part of this. And so when the early Christians were starting to be seen as distinct from the Jewish group, that unsettled a lot, the status quo. Yeah. And so actually a very famous martyr in the early church by the name of Polycarp, who was burned to death while he was alive in the year 155, he comes from Smyrna. And there were many martyrs in Smyrna. And you may remember the word martyr is a Greek word that means witness. And that's a legal term. Tell us what you've seen. But for those who witnessed to what Jesus had done in their life, who bore testimony that he was, in fact, the one on high, Lord and Savior, not the Roman imperial system, not Zeus, off with their head. It was serious stuff.
Yeah.
So,
what do we learn from? What's the takeaway from Smyrna?
Yeah. Well, don't back down.
Yeah.
It's not to say that you need to sort of muscle up and be obnoxiously, in your face about what you believe. But Jesus is clear: be faithful unto death.
Right.
You're going to be thrown into prison.
Right.
For 10 days. Now, does that mean 10 literal days? Maybe not.
Yeah.
In the book of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 1, Daniel and his friends said, hey, we're going to run this test for 10 days. Don't feed us. See what happens. But often in this kind of literature, day stands for a larger period of time, maybe a year, so forth. And also prison.
Yes.
Prison was like the on-ramp to worse things.
Yeah.
It wasn't, hey, we'll put you in prison. We've got a library. We've got a cafeteria. And just you're going to hang out for 10 days. It was, no, you're probably going to be tortured. You're going to be interrogated. You probably will be killed. You may be sent off to forced labor. But Jesus says, don't back down. Just like we read about in Philippians 2, Jesus emptied himself, became obedient all the way to death. He's saying, be obedient to death. And on the far side of that, I will give you the crown of life. And in that culture, athletes who won the race would be given a crown. It was a common thing. In fact, interestingly, the exhortation to conquer in all these letters uses the word Nike, Nikao.
We've talked about that before. Yeah.
In fact, I was watching like this business classy advertising thing yesterday that was breaking down Nike's strategy in different cultures, and how does Nike brand itself in London versus China versus America, and
that's interesting.
It's global strategy where it like retains its global cachet, but it's targeted to local, whatever. And a lot of it kind of they want you to feel like, I wear Nike, like I am better than, I'm hardcore. Yeah. I do hard things. And whatever. But to me, that's kind of a parody or sort of a watering down of the real sort of conquering that's in view here. It's not about like personal swag, Right. It's about like, no, actually, the Lamb has conquered, and he didn't conquer through force. He conquered through the power of suffering love. Yeah. And that's how I'm going to conquer too. Yeah. And
and another, I think you were going to hit on it, but the tree of life stands in
thank you.
God's paradise. Now we have the right to eat it. So what? I first of all, I just have to say I love the let anyone who has an ear hear what the Spirit is saying into the churches, and the line after it is always like this new thing. I think that's very. Yes. I love that. I think it's very interesting. So can you speak to the tree of life?
Yes, I forgot that from Ephesus. Thanks for bringing us back to that. Yeah. And then on Smyrna, we'll come to the second death.
Yes.
So let's talk about these two things.
I actually did get those two mixed up. Okay.
Tree of life.
And then
I'm glad you got it mixed up, because so did I.
Okay. Yeah. So Ephesus is tree of life. Smyrna is the second death. Okay,
that's right.
So speak
to
what
about
those?
Okay. So the tree of life appears Genesis 2, verse 9. In the center of the garden, there's trees, tree of life, tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And after Adam and Eve sin, the cherubim are put at the boundary so that to block the way to the tree of life. But at the end of the book, the tree of life appears again. And in fact, not just one. The tree of life is planted on both sides of the river that flows from the throne, and the leaves of the trees aren't for the cursing of human; they're for the healing of the nations. And it says, in fact, no longer will there be anything accursed. So the tree of life does become available, even though it was sort of woven into the problem at the beginning in the Garden of Eden. But local application in Ephesus, in the temple of Artemis, there was a garden that centered on a sacred tree. And this tree wasn't just for worshiping. It was, my understanding is, the center of a system of asylum, so that convicts or people wanted by the law could come near the tree, and now they're free. Okay. But the tree in Revelation isn't for unrepentant people who are like, well, I'm just going to escape to the tree to get off for what I did. The tree is for the repentant ones, the ones who say, I'm gonna turn my life over to God and pursue holiness. Yeah. So there's both biblical and cultural points of reference here that help us understand that.
Okay. That's good.
So now the second death.
Second death will not harm the one.
Right.
Who conquers.
Right.
So what is the second death?
That's an interesting question. So it comes up again at the end of Revelation.
Okay.
And there's like the first death where bodies die, I guess. After which, the immaterial part of our being is received by Jesus. It's a time of rest and rejoicing, but ultimately the end game is new bodies.
Yes.
For those who've been in Jesus, resurrection. But the second death is like Satan and his hordes are like thrown in. It's like the second death, the lake of fire. It like death dies.
Like death.
Or like
death. Ultimate death.
But it seems to be, there's different ways to think about this. Some have spoken of like annihilation, sort of like you're just your personality, your soul is canceled. Right. You just don't exist anymore. But the Bible and many other places does talk about like, no, there is like an eternal torment, or like it doesn't end. It's not like, well, I can go live however I want. Then there will be a small period of discomfort, but then that'll be over. I think the Bible's not super clear about that.
Okay.
I think that you could make a biblical case for either or.
Sure.
I don't think that annihilationism means that you're some sort of liberal who doesn't believe in hell. But I also don't think that like the idea of conscious eternal punishment means that you must be just like some hateful, bigoted conservative. But there are glimpses of both in the Bible, and ultimately it's a mystery. Evil is a mystery.
Mm-hmm.
Love is a mystery. Evil is a mystery, which is to say we cannot fully understand it.
Yeah.
It's deeply bizarre, and there's all sorts of philosophy and theology of evil that builds that idea out.
Mm-hmm.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, in a sense.
Yeah.
I mean, we won't have them all answered, but
yeah.
Okay. So with Smyrna, were there any more things you wanted to talk about before we move on to the next church?
Yeah, I think just circling back to the big idea, which is to say that endurance through persecution, through the hard, is part of how God brings out true riches in us.
Yeah.
It's not God is punishing you or God is left you.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually God is using this to purify and
Mm-hmm.
bring out of you latent beauty. And so that's a great encouragement to us.
It is. It is very encouraging.
So shall we go on to the next? We get Pergamum next.
We got Pergamum. Okay. Chapter 2, verse 12. Write this to the angel of the church in Pergamum. These are the words of the one who has the sharp two-edged sword. I know where you live, right where the Satan has his throne. You have clung on to my name and have not denied my faith. Even in the days of Antipas, my faithful witness who was killed in your midst, right there where the Satan lives. But I do have a few things against you. You have some people there who hold the teaching of Balaam, who instructed Balak to cause the children of Israel to stumble, making them eat idol food and engage in fornication. So too, you have some among you who hold the teaching of the Nicolaitans. So repent. If you don't, I will come to you quickly and will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. To anyone who conquers, I will give secret manna and a white stone with a new name written on that stone, which nobody knows except the one who receives it.
Wow. So yeah, a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And a lot of sort of hyperlinks that unless you know where they lead, you're like, like the Balaam and Balak thing and the throne of Satan and all this stuff. And what
the days of Antipas.
The days of Antipas. Okay, let's start there. So Antipas seems to have been somebody who was killed for his faith. And, once the legal precedent was set for that, that opens the door for other killings of Christians. So he seems to be one of the first martyrs in the church.
Who bore witness.
Yeah, that's right. So let's try to decode a few of these phrases.
Yeah.
So Satan's throne seems to be an allusion. So Pergamum had a big acropolis, a big sort of city center that was a high mountain. You could see it from far away.
Okay.
And the Acropolis is where the temples are and so forth.
Okay.
And so imagine you're miles around this city and you can see up there buildings from far away, almost like you can see San Francisco from the East Bay and you're like, boom, there's the city over there.
Yeah.
Kind of like that, except for the big buildings. Some of them would have been like altars to the emperor, temples to the emperor. I mean, imagine if there was like the temple to Trump or the temple to Obama.
Yeah.
That was like the centerpiece of the town.
You see it in the distance.
Everybody had to go up there to worship.
Yeah.
And John isn't saying that Rome is the devil.
Okay.
He's saying that Satan is using Rome to amplify human wickedness, to persecute the church, that all human kingdoms, if they're not oriented to the King of Kings, ultimately become Babylon in some way. Mm-hmm. And we'll get more into that sort of imagery later in the book.
Okay.
So, but this Satan's throne thing seems to be referencing, again, Pergamum had a big temple to Zeus and also stuff for, worshiping the emperor and this and that. So that seems to be in the background. There's another little wrinkle here. So one of the gods in that age was called Asclepius. Asclepius. When Socrates dies in ancient Greek philosophy, the last thing that he says as he drinks the poison is he says, "I got to pay something back to Asclepius. Pay my debts, would you?" Or something like that. Yeah, it's this weird random thing. It's the god of healing.
Oh, okay.
And so in that setting, Socrates seems to be saying, "I am dying, but now I'm being healed of this mortal condition."
Okay.
Which actually points to the anti-Christian view that the body is the body is a prison. The body is this bad thing, and if only I could get rid of it, then I would be healed. Then I would be free.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Because that's what some people think
Absolutely.
Revelation is about.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Well, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's a whole lot to say there. But if we think that the whole Christian story is about escaping my body so that I can go off to heaven forever and get rid of this body in this bad material world, that's not Christianity.
Right.
That's Platonism. That's Gnosticism. That's some sub-biblical fake for the gospel. Mm-hmm. Now, this god Asclepius was sometimes figured as a little snake. And that snake would sometimes even be on the coinage of the city. And later in the book, in chapter 20, John identifies the devil as that ancient serpent. So it could be, when he's talking about Satan has his throne here, maybe it's layered allusion to Asclepius. Yeah, isn't that a fun word to say? You send your little kids, go to Asclepius, child. There.
Oh, my goodness.
So now here, it mentions Balaam and Balak.
Yes, which we've heard of them before in early New Testament.
Right.
Yes.
So they are from, this is a story in the book of Numbers. The Israelites are wandering in the desert. They're coming in towards the promised land, and local rulers are like, uh-oh, we want to get rid of these people. And so this local Moabite king, Balak, hires a guy, a prophet for hire from far away, and says, hey, I want you to come and I want you to curse these people.
Right.
Because words have power. So I want you to stand up there and bring on the curses of the gods. So Balaam comes and he's like, well, they're going to pay the fee, so I'll do that. But then God forbids him to curse them, and he actually blesses them. And Balak's like, that's not what I'm paying you for, bro. I asked for a curse.
Yeah.
So you guys tries 3 times. It's a very famous passage. Yeah. This is Numbers chapters 22 through 24. And there's even messianic prophecy in there. Balaam is talking about a star shall come forth from Jacob. And, but then this is the real twist in the tale of that story. The cursing fails.
Right.
But what follows right after this moment when God protects his people is that the Israelites start to go wild with parties and fornication and idolatry with the local Moabites. And so it seems to be that, instead of coming if the full frontal assault doesn't work, get them with the sneaky seductions.
Right.
And turns out that's still very effective today. So, sexual immorality in the Old Testament is often a way of speaking of unfaithfulness to God, because our relationship with God is seen as sort of like a marriage type, covenantal type bonding. And so when their loyalties got complicated and started worshiping other gods, often that's spoken of in terms of adultery or fornication. You've been unfaithful to me, God says. So both of those could be in view here when it's talking about Balaam. Okay. But it's the 2 components that often go together are worship of other gods and sexual immorality. And in ancient temples, that was the place to go, like find a call girl or a prostitute.
Right.
And so those things went hand in hand very much. And that's what he's saying. You've got to resist that. You've got to, even still today, there's Christians who would want to say, no, the gospel is liberation for your sexuality, and you can worship Jesus, and because God, there's a variety of different ways that people try to justify this, but both then and now, that is actually out of bounds for Christians. And it's not because Christians are a bunch of prudes.
Right.
Actually, according to statistics, over the course of a life, married Christians have more and better sex than people who are non-Christians, because it's so, there's a variety of reasons for that. But, and this is a whole other conversation, but the Christian view of men and women together in marriage mirrors heaven and earth, and that complementarity. The whole story of Revelation is driving towards a wedding scene. So there's a deep, what John Paul II calls the spousal meaning of the body. Yeah. That gift is inscribed in our very biology, and that gift, we are meant to give ourselves away in love, man for woman, woman for man. Anyways, So that's in play. And tying onto that, so the Israelites are out in the wilderness, right?
Mm-hmm.
How is God providing for them during that time? How
Manna,
are they eating?
Manna from heaven.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. So he's saying, like, I know that you feel like you're out in the wilderness, but I'm going to provide for you what you need when you need it. And there's this whole little bit about a white stone.
Yeah, that was my question. I'm like, I know what manna is. What is this white stone?
Yeah, there's different guesses. They say that ancient juries, if they voted guilty, would put a black stone. If they voted innocent, would put a white stone.
Okay.
And this does nothing to do with like skin color or things like that.
Yeah.
It often has to do with ideas of like dirtiness and cleanliness.
Uh-huh.
Like it'll talk about like your dirty clothes versus your clean clothes.
Yes.
And when people are baptized, they were given a new set of clean white clothes to signify purity and all that stuff. It seems to be that the buildings around there were the local stone was a very dark stone, like a deep brownish black. Mm-hmm. And so then when they wanted to put signs on a building, they would use white stone because of the contrast. And
that's interesting.
They'd put the names of a building there.
Got it.
And what's cool is it's a name that nobody knows except you. You and Jesus only know that name. And that's a really like kind of an intimate detail.
It is,
kind of like kind of your BFF super secret handshake. Like this is a unique, intimate type friendship, which then brings up a contrast of the sort of false intimacy on offer in spiritual and sexual unfaithfulness. Yeah. It's enticing, it's alluring, but it's actually false intimacy. Mm-hmm. Jesus offers the real intimacy. Mm-hmm. And so again, it's accessing those deep motivations of the heart. Like, what do I really yearn for? I yearn to be known and to know. Yeah. And of course, throughout the Bible, at critical junctures in many people's lives, they get a new name. Peter gets a new name. Mm-hmm. Abraham gets a new name. Jacob gets a new name. All these people, and someday we will get new names. Yeah. Isn't that cool?
That is very cool.
Yeah.
That is very cool. I like that even though this is written to a group of people and to a very specific church, there is something there, new name written on it, that which no one knows except the one who receives it. Like it just makes it, like you said, intimate, personal.
Yeah.
And that's encouraging.
Yeah. I was reading this, I found myself thinking, I wonder what my new name will be. Like what?
What's my rock gonna look? My white stone.
What will God see in me that maybe I don't see in myself?
Yeah.
Or, yeah. So, okay, shall we on to the next one?
Let's.
Okay, which one is next?
Can you say it?
Thyatira.
Thyatira. So
I've got two Thyatiras right above my cafeteria. No, just kidding. Okay, terrible joke. Probably should cut that out. I don't know.
Great.
Okay, so you want to read Thyatira for us?
Yes, the letter to Thyatira. This is chapter 2. We're starting in verse 18. Write this to the angel of the church in Thyatira. These are the words of the Son of God, whose eyes are like flaming fire and whose feet are like exquisite brass. I know what you have done. I know your love, your faith, your service, and your patience. I know that your works have been more impressive recently than they were before, but I have something against you. You tolerate the woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophet and deceives my servants by teaching them to practice fornication and to eat idol food. I gave her time to repent, but she had no wish to repent of her immorality. Look, I am going to throw her on a bed, and those who have committed fornication with her will have great distress unless they repent of the works into which she has led them. I will utterly slaughter her children, and all the churches will know that I am the one who searches minds and hearts. I will give to each of you what your deeds deserve. For the rest of you in Thyatira, those who have not held this teaching, who haven't discovered the so-called satanic depths, I'm not going to put any other pressure on you. Just hold on tightly to what you have until I come. To anyone who conquers, who keeps my works right through the end, I will give authority over the nations to rule them with a rod of iron, smashing them like clay pots. That is the authority I myself received from my Father. What's more, I will give them the morning star. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit says to the churches.
So let's start with the description of Jesus. Mm-hmm. He's got these bronze legs. Isn't that right? Is that what it said?
The words I said, whose eyes are like flaming fire and whose feet are like exquisite brass.
Yeah. Oh, brass. Thank you.
Yeah.
So apparently, this town, like a lot of ancient towns, had trade guilds, like groups of, it's like a union prototype, sort of, people who work in the same group, same vocation, looking out for each other.
Mm-hmm.
And this was by trade. So there was a brass guild.
Okay.
And so speaking the language of, that people there would recognize. And one of the local cults was to the god Apollo, who is affiliated with the sun. So he's very bright. So you have Jesus here, who's, his eyes are flaming. He's like, the sun, i.e. better than Apollo. And his feet are this exquisite, did you say brass? Sorry, I get mixed up with bronze. And so speaking local language, but let's come to Jezebel.
Yeah.
So again, like Balaam in the prior letter, infamous figure from the Old Testament, book of 1 Kings, she's a foreign princess, actually. She comes from the Phoenicia, which is north of Israel. She marries Ahab, and together they're just like, terrible, and they real estate, killing people to gobble up land, and she's not it calls her a prophet, or a so-called prophet, but she herself wasn't a prophet, but she had 900 prophets under her authority. This is where Elijah has the big showdown with them, yes? And then in 2 Kings 9, she is said to be both a prostitute and like into witchcraft.
Yeah.
And so both of those elements are kind of in the background here of, again, both spiritual unfaithfulness, ethical unfaithfulness, but also like interest in the occult. And in some ancient religions in that world are sometimes called mystery religions, where there was a sort of an initiation process, and only if you were on the inside would they really let you know the deep mysteries. And seems that maybe some Christians were like, yeah, well, because we have Jesus, we should march right into that and go right into the enemy's camp and learn all that stuff. And he's saying, no, don't, what Jesus says, be shrewd as serpents, but innocent as doves.
Right.
So like, yes, be aware that there is evil in the world,
right,
but I also want you to stay apart from it.
Yeah.
So the Jezebel thing is very similar to the Balaam thing, which is to say, he's saying to the church, you cannot be tolerant of compromise. So this is the challenge to be a Christian and in community, love and truth.
Yeah.
Truth and love.
Yeah.
How do you be gracious in acceptance without compromising truth?
Yeah.
And several of the churches are teetering one way or the other. And Jesus is adamant about both of them. And so here he's saying, you can't, don't let Jezebel, quote unquote, into the church, because that, just like it ruined ancient Israel and brought great heart, it will do the same thing for you. So that's going on. Towards the end, Jesus uses a couple images that are really important to unpack. So he says, I will give you authority over the nations to smash them like pots.
Yeah.
And that's quoting from Psalm chapter 2, which is one of the most famous Messianic writings of the Old Testament. There, it begins, why do the nations rage? And everybody's freaking out, and they're raging against God's Holy One, against his Messiah, who's there in Zion. And God says, this day I have begotten you, and you are my son, and all this stuff. And I will make the nations serve you. You will rule them with an iron rod, all this kind of stuff. So he's saying to the church, I will one day share my very authority with you. God has given me that authority. I'm going to share it with you. Now, it's important we don't get this idea that Jesus is on like a rage and just because he's, just pissed off and is just hurting people.
Sure.
It's not personal revenge like that. It is a very measured, wise refusal to allow things to continue to damage creation and to distort and dehumanize what God has made. And God says, I am not in for that.
Right.
And so it's important that we understand the spirit behind it. Like when he says, I will utterly slaughter all of Jezebel's children.
Yeah.
So first of all, children is often a term for disciple.
Yeah.
Like Isaiah chapter 8, he talks about his disciples as his children that God has given him. And Jesus is saying, like, I am not going to give a permanent place in the church to students and teachers who follow that way.
I have kind of an analogy, I guess.
Okay.
And forgive me if this is not on track, but
I don't know if I'll forgive you, Lindsay.
As far as that, like, that righteous purifying of stuff.
Yeah.
I have like a little garden. It's not a great garden. It's a very little garden, but
Okay.
I have green onions. Very easy to just plant in the ground and they will grow.
Are those called shallots?
Maybe.
Okay.
Maybe I am not the one to say yes or no.
I have a dream to learn plant names, but I've never.
Talk to Bishop, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so these green onions, and they were growing and they were doing really great. And then I started seeing these like little black dots, and then I'm like, I don't know, that's weird. It's probably just dirt
On the onions?
on the stalk of the
Interesting.
the green onion, and they just kept getting more and more of these like black dots. And it turns out they were a bug, and the bug was killing the plant, and it's gross. So had to completely wipe out that whole section and remove it and rip it out in order and let the ground be purified so those bugs would go away.
Wow.
And then I was able to, plant new ones, and I haven't seen them since. But there was a purpose to being kind of harsh and like literally ripping out all that stuff.
Yep.
Ripping out the filth, ripping out the thing that was actually killing the plant in order for it to
That's a great
produce,
metaphor. Yeah.
like growth again.
Yeah.
So it seems harsh and aggressive
Exactly.
to like literally kill it, but it's for the good of for new growth and creation.
Right. This is where the concept that you can draw an equal sign between love and tolerance of everything. Like love is just always tolerant. That's honestly, it's like kind of juvenile. It's like, have you lived?
Yeah.
Like, don't you realize that at some point love has a protective sort of like intolerant dimension?
Yeah.
It does.
Yeah.
So that's a great metaphor.
Yeah.
Great. There's one last little detail. Jesus says, I'm going to give you the morning star.
Yeah. What's this morning star?
So there's a lot going on there.
Heard it before.
First of all, so the morning star is Venus, actually.
Oh.
And if you, like, in the pre-dawn hours, in the sky of the west, right, the east, I think it's the west, there's a very bright star.
Yeah.
That's a planet. That's Venus.
Okay.
And so a few things. Later in the book, in chapter 22, Jesus says that he is the bright morning star.
Mm-hmm.
So when Jesus says, I'll give you the morning star, he's saying, I'll give you myself.
Mm-hmm. Oh, dang.
Remember also that Jesus holds the 7 stars in his hands, and there were 7 classical planets, the 7 classical planets of antiquity, which are, they were seen to kind of control the cosmos. They were a sign of power. So again, Jesus is not only sharing his very identity with his people, because he is the morning star, he's again sharing his messianic authority with his people. And last element here is that just as the morning star is brightest right before the day, Christian living is to be sort of like that pre-dawn sign that like here, the new day is coming. Yeah. And we shine bright with God's help in a dark world, but it's a sign of a type of light coming that is immeasurably larger, you know? So that's a really, I think, a beautiful way to think about what Christian living is. It's a sign to the world of a coming day.
A new day.
Yeah.
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 That is really nice.
Yeah.
Okay. Any more thoughts on
I don't think so.
How do you say it again? Thyatira.
Thyatira. I've heard Thyatira.
Okay.
It could be something else. I don't know.
Okay, great.
On to Sardis.
All right. The letter to Sardis.
Okay.
Are you ready?
Do it.
Okay, here we go. We are moving on to chapter 3 now. Verse 1. Write this to the angel of the church in Sardis. These are the words of the one who has the 7 spirits of God, the 7 stars. I know what you have done. You have the reputation of being alive, but you are dead. Wake up, strengthen the things that remain, the things that are about to die, because I haven't found your work to be complete in the sight of my God. So remember how you received the message, how you heard it and kept it, and repent. So if you don't keep awake, I will come like a thief, and you won't know what time I am coming to you. You do, however. Have a few people in Sardis who haven't allowed their clothes to become dirty and polluted. They will be clothed in white and will walk with me as they deserve. Anyone who conquers will be clothed like this in white robes and won't blot their name out of the book of life. I will acknowledge their name in the presence of my Father and in the presence of his angels. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches.
Yeah, so this church has a very common spiritual problem, which is where someone's reputation or what people can see on the outside does not match what's really going on the inside.
Okay.
And they're dead on the inside. And Jesus is giving them a sharp word. You got to wake up because I'm going to come. And Jesus in his earthly ministry loved this idea of a thief coming in the night. And, if you knew I was coming, you would have set the alarm. You would have, blockaded the doors, but you didn't know. Yeah. And I'm going to come. And there was some real backstory here in the town of Sardis because, like most of these ancient cities were chosen for military defensiveness purposes. They wanted to be high. High ground is always better than low ground, and usually a water supply and trade routes and a variety of factors. But Sardis was a town that really was like, we are impregnable. We've got this amazing Acropolis. We're safe. Except for 2 points in its history, it had a surprise attack when nobody was expecting it. 600 years before Jesus, there was actually King Cyrus of Persia, who figures in the Old Testament and other places. His army came. At the time, a famous king named Croesus was the ruler in Sardis, and somebody scaled up the cliffs in the dead of night and kind of like opened the gates, or somehow there was a surprise attack, and the town was caught sleeping, and it was conquered. And Jesus is saying, you all need to learn that lesson too. You're feeling, you've got the reputation of being a church that's got it going on, that is alive and doing all this stuff. But I know that actually there's a hollow core.
Yeah.
An image that comes to my mind for this is like, you ever seen like a big tree fall over?
Yes.
And once you can see the cross section of the trunk, you could see that the heartwood at the center was hollowed out. And there was no way of knowing looking at the outside of the tree.
Yeah.
But from the inside, you can't. Although there is a way of knowing. I saw a forester once who was checking the trees, and he was looking for little trails of sawdust, which he said would be the ants or the termites
eating
that
away.
As they bored and then as they came out, they would leave these little trails. And that's how you can know looking at the outside, the inside of this tree is actually rotten.
Oh, jeez.
And
this is interesting. This is pretty relevant to us today if you think about social media too. Like if you look at someone's feed and they just everything has, it's all together. But that is what is on the outside. That is what is on display. That is what has a reputation of being great.
Totally.
Could have so many followers. But we never know what is happening truly on the inside of a person.
Right.
And so this call to like, hey, pay attention to what is on the inside.
Absolutely.
And make that be the healthy thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. I've recently discovered, I don't spend a lot of time on social media, or like none.
Sure.
But
that's why I'm like, I'll bring it up.
Thank you, Lindsay.
You're welcome. I got you.
Our cultural consultant.
Yeah.
No, I mean, but I've recently like discovered like LinkedIn a little bit more. And so there's if there's a sort of Instagram-y, Facebook-y way of signaling your glam life, there is very much a LinkedIn way of doing it too.
Oh, for sure.
And people's like
accomplishments and
the like over-the-top verbiage of how amazing you are. It's like, did you write that about yourself?
And how this is the way you should be doing things. This is the
it's like we never really grow out of this, do we? This sort of like hampering, you know, and we all do it.
Totally.
I
looked in the mirror before I walked in here and make sure like there's nothing out of place, you know, or
there you go.
It's just part of what we do. Yeah.
It is. But you know, I think that at the end of the day, I think one of our favorite idols as humans is ourselves.
Yeah.
And, you know, that could be where our highest love is actually me.
Self.
And and so we gotta fight against that. And he uses the image here again of white garments so that there would be inner purity. And we were talking about this with the previous letter, but if you had soiled garments, some temples wouldn't let you inside. The Jerusalem priests wore white. Again, we mentioned when early Christians were baptized, they would get a new gown of white.
Right.
When there was a Roman triumph, like a military parade, everybody wore white. And so these are signaling achievement, conquering, victory. That's what the white robe signifies.
Mm-hmm.
And then this whole idea of the book of life. Now, this appears already in the Old Testament in Exodus 32. It's towards the end, right?
Yeah.
Their names will not be blotted out of the book of life.
So verse 5, anyone who conquers will be clothed like this in robes of white. Verse 5, I won't blot their name out of the book of life. I will acknowledge their name in the presence of my Father and in the presence of his angels.
Right. Yeah. There's this amazing scene in the book of Exodus where Moses has been up on the mountain. He's getting the 10 Commandments, and down at the bottom of the mountain, the people are going crazy.
Yeah.
Golden calf. Moses shatters all the, and he comes back up, and God's like, all right, I'm done with them. I'm going to wipe them out.
Mm-hmm.
And Moses says, because he's a real prophet, he says, no, don't do that. Have mercy. And he goes, if you won't have mercy of them, erase me from the book of life. And it's a moment where on the holy mountain, the intermediary figure is laying down his life for the people.
Wow.
It's Exodus 32:32. It's very, very.
I need to read that again.
Yeah. And I love the verb there in Hebrew because it's the word that in modern Hebrew means like an eraser on a pen or something. Like literally like, God, just erase me from your book. And that whole idea of a book or a roll call was common in the ancient world. Cities would have a registry of citizens. And it's kind of appealing to that. Like there's a registry in heaven and you got to have your name on the list.
Yeah.
And to get on that list, your reputation is not enough. Mm-hmm. The good family you came from is not enough. Mm-hmm. Your church membership card is not enough. It's got to you have to have a real faith.
Yeah.
And as Jesus says in one of these letters, I think it was the previous one, they will know that I am the one who searches hearts and minds.
Yeah.
He's the mind searcher, the heart searcher.
Yeah.
You can't fake him. You can't fool him.
Nope.
And which doesn't mean he demands perfection, but he does demand real faith.
Yeah.
And so these are sobering, but friends tell the truth.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
that's what we can learn from the church of Sardis.
Yep.
Okay.
On to Philadelphia.
Let's read Philadelphia.
Okay.
Write this to the angel of the church in Philadelphia. These are the words of the Holy One, the true one, the one who has the key of David, who opens and nobody shuts, who shuts and nobody opens. I know your works. Look, I have given you an open door right in front of you, and nobody can shut it since you have a little power. You have kept my word, and you haven't denied my name. Look, this is what I will do to the Satan synagogue, who call themselves Jews, but who are frauds, nothing of the kind. Take note, this is what I will grant you, that I will make them come and worship before your feet, and that they will know that I have loved you. You have kept my word about patience, and so I will keep you from the time of trial that is going to come upon the whole world, to test out all the inhabitants of the earth. I am coming quickly. Hold on to what you have so that nobody takes away your crown. Anyone who conquers, I will make them a pillar in the temple of my God. They will never go out of it again. I will write on that person the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God, and my own new name. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches.
I love that. Like if you got to pick one, like the promise, I'm like, I want that one. Because I love Jerusalem so much. And I'm just like, give me the Jerusalem tattoo.
Yeah.
Write it on, it's super cool.
Well, we might get into this too, but what stood out to me is the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God, and not like us going
exactly.
up to heaven. Yeah.
No, that's a huge insight.
Yeah.
That's a huge insight, that it is about the marriage of heaven and earth.
Yes.
And this gets back deeply to the idea of temple theology in the Old Testament, that heaven and earth were never meant to be far distant. They were always meant to interlock like that. Temple was the place where those things overlap, and humans are designed to stand at that frontier.
Yeah.
And so good. That takes us to this image in this little letter about you will be pillars in the temple.
Okay.
And the idea that the church is not a temple of brick and mortar, but a temple of humans,
People.
In some ancient architecture that probably these people would have been familiar with. You could see this like in Athens and stuff. Some of the pillars of these ancient temples will be carved into the shape of women and men. And it's really beautiful because it looks like the women and men are holding up the building.
Yeah.
And we know it's just a marble pillar, but
Sure.
it's been shaped. And that's kind
It's
of
a good reminder.
It is.
Like it'll be, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And in Galatians 2, Paul says, I went up to Jerusalem, but I only spent time with those who were the pillars of the church. And sometimes that's the kind of metaphor that you can hear so much, he's a pillar, that we kind of lose the punch of it.
Yeah.
Like, oh, so you mean like you're a temple or
Right.
the larger structure?
Well, even around church and here our church, like every now and then we'll have conversations and like, oh, that saint,
Yeah, exactly.
Sister Sue is
Your parents are pillars of the church.
They're pillars
Very
of the church.
much.
So, but that's there's stability. There's I don't know what
Stability, absolutely.
Yeah.
Beauty,
yeah
stability, like
consistency.
And it's like if you remove them, things fall down.
Yeah.
They're the sine qua non, that which outwith not. Like if you remove them, it's a bad situation.
Something's gonna crumble. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And remember, Judaism before the destruction of the temple in the year 70 was a very much a temple-centric religion. And so in the book of Acts, it's kind of like dueling temples. There's the Jerusalem temple, but then just down the hill, there's the Jesus community who, the Holy Spirit and coming and giving fire and sound of wind. It's like the Old Testament infillings of the temple. So it's sort of these, there's a sort of a transference of the temple from the physical building to the people. But that antagonism kind of continued. And again, in this entry, we get a polemic against the Jewish community. And we shouldn't imagine it like, across the street, there's the little Lutheran church and there's the little synagogue. It wasn't like that. It was like, here's a Jewish community with several thousand people. They got their own buildings. They got real estate. They're an institution. And then here's like a couple dozen Christians. Right. It's very, just at a numerical level early on, it's certainly not apples and apples. Yeah. This is very different. But remember, this is an intra-Jewish debate. This is not Christian anti-Semitism. This is Jews talking to Jews about, is it the case that followers of Jesus are really walking in the fulfillment of the promises to the patriarchs? Yes or no? And that's the issue. And so we got to remember that. I love the image also of the keys.
Of David?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is a reference to Isaiah 22.
The one who has the key of David.
Yeah.
Who opens and nobody
Mafteach
shuts.
David.
Mafteach David.
Yeah, exactly. That was perfect.
Did I do it? Okay,
yeah, that was perfect.
Great.
Yeah, that was perfect. Isaiah 22. And I love that it says, I loved how you read it too. You read it, I don't know what the punctuation is, but there's a door that's open and no one can shut it because you have a little strength or since you have a little strength. And that's just, for me, is really encouraging because it's like, okay, I see these open opportunities in my life, but I've got very little strength to pull it off. But that's okay. In fact, sometimes acknowledging our own limited resources is the prerequisite to God's abundant resources showing up.
Yes.
His power itself is made perfect in our weakness. And so I find that very encouraging. And this is one of the churches that doesn't get a rebuke or a warning. He's basically saying,
I was going to ask that. Yeah.
Yeah, I see your good work. Carry on.
Keep going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
there's the Satan synagogue is in this one again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But remember that the Satan, the accusing.
Yes.
So there's real danger for people who are being outed as sort of, well, they're not real Jews, and now they're in trouble with the law, and doing that function of the Satan.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Okay.
Shall we go on to the last one?
We should. We kind of went backwards on that last church, but
that's
good. I don't know. We started at the end and then kind of went back to the beginning.
You know what? By number 6, it's time to do something. Do it fresh.
I'm going to switch it up.
All right. So now we're ending with Laodicea, the church that
Laodicea.
has nothing positive about it.
Yeah.
The lukewarm
so
people
the two
that
opposites are
vomit out. Yeah, exactly.
Next door to each other.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, you want to read it for us?
Let's do it. So verse 14, letter to Laodicea. Write this to the angel of the church in Laodicea. These are the words of the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the beginning of God's creation. I know your works. You are neither cold nor hot. I wish you were either cold or hot. So because you are lukewarm, neither cold nor hot, I'm going to vomit you out of my mouth. You say, I'm rich. I've done well. I don't need anything. But you don't know that you are miserable, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked. This is my advice to you. Buy from the gold refined in the fire that'll make you rich, and white clothes to cover yourselves and prevent your shameful nakedness being seen, and also healing ointment to put on your eyes so that you will be able to see. When it comes to my friends, I tell them when they're in the wrong, and I punish them for it. So stir up your spirits and repent. Look, I'm standing here, knocking at the door. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into them and eat with them, and they with me. This will be my gift to the one who conquers. I will sit them beside me on the throne, just as I conquered and sat with my Father on his throne. Let the one who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. All right.
Yeah, so this letter has so much, this is so juicy. Like there's so many little connections to this first century town of Laodicea that really opens it up for us. So let's just go through several of these.
Okay.
There's the bit where he's like, you say I'm rich, I'm all good.
Yeah.
But in fact, you're pitiful, poor, blind, and naked, and so forth.
Right.
So this was a well-known ancient banking center. And
Laodicea was?
Yes.
Okay.
And there had been in the 60s, early 60s of the first century, a major earthquake that destroyed all the towns in the area. And the state showed up, like the Roman Empire, and said, we're going to fund you to rebuild. Mm-hmm. But Laodicea said, we're good. We got enough resources on our own that we don't need your help, actually.
Okay.
And so this whole idea of you say you're self-sufficient and fine, but no, you're not. You're radically dependent. That's why he says, I advise you to buy gold that is real or that won't rot or whatever. Yeah. And it's sort of a dig at the banking industry and these people who have so much gold. So there's that.
Refined in the fire.
Yeah. Yeah.
Buy me gold refined in the fire.
And then several other little details like that, I will give a white robe. Mm-hmm. Apparently there was a very fashionable black wool industry, like black wool clothing was like in vogue.
Okay.
And so it's sort of a contrast to that. Also, there was a famous medical school there that had eye salve and stuff. So he says, get eye salve.
Yeah.
So it'd be like saying to people at UCSF, like, I encourage you to eat your vitamins or something like that's very on point for them.
Yeah.
Now, the most famous allusion is this whole idea of lukewarmness.
Yes, that's what I remember.
Yeah. So Laodicea had an interesting situation where they didn't have a good water supply. So they had to pipe it in with aqueducts, those arched things and the very gentle gradient and all the water would come down. Now they had 2 inlets of water. One came from cold springs about 6 miles away.
Oh.
But in the Turkish heat, by the time it traveled 6 miles, it's warm. On the opposite end, there was actually nearby in the town of Pamukkale or something like that. Fact check me on that. There's very famous hot springs, and they have like a mineral deposit all over the side of the hill, and it's a big tourist thing. And the water actually today comes like into the hotels, and it's a big thing.
Okay.
And that hot water, when it got piped into Laodicea, was also now not hot, lukewarm. Cold water, real cold water, what's it for? Drinking. Real hot water, what's it for? Bathing.
Purify, yeah.
And so Jesus is saying, if you were hot, you had a purpose. Bathing. If you were cold, you had a purpose. But given that you're lukewarm, I'm just going to vomit you out. And it's, he's basically saying, you make me sick. And I mean, it's a punchy rebuke. And of course, it ties in with our spiritual life. Like if you're just sort of middling, just sort of coasting, Jesus is like, I'm done with that.
Yeah.
Like I've found in my life, I often prefer talking to like dyed in the wool atheists or they're just so much more interesting to me than sort of just like floating Christians who don't know what they think, but they just meh. Yeah. There's a sort of like, I would prefer extremes almost than just kind of floating along. And so there's some interesting ancient background, but it also has some applicability to our spiritual lives.
There's influence and change happens with like the hot or the cold.
Yeah.
Like, and then there's chemically even, like if the chemistry of it too, but it's kind of same with us.
Yeah.
Like if you are not passionate about something, like, what are you?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. G.K. Chesterton, this British writer in the 19th century, has this, or maybe early 20th, has this great riff in his book Orthodoxy about, he's talking about how in Christianity, you're bringing together extremes.
Mm-hmm.
So you should be totally extreme about the quest for holiness and totally extreme about God's radical loving acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, how do you hold those two side by side? And he says, if one is red and the other is white, is the goal to become pink and kind of blurred together?
Mm-hmm.
He says, not at all. The goal is to stay totally white and totally red and bring both of those together. Yes, like a candy cane.
Like intertwined.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah. And so, to your point, there are, in general, we are unhealthy in extremes. If the devil can't hold you back, he'll push you. That's all very true.
Sure.
Balance is a great thing. But seen from another aspect, the faith does require us to hold in tension the lion and the lamb.
Yeah.
It doesn't want something in the middle. It wants the lion and the lamb.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
actually, that candy cane is like a really good way for my brain to process how to do both of those things.
Yeah.
Not to mix them in such a way that they are muddied and lose their contrast, lose their influence, but to have them work harmoniously together, yet separate.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah. No, that's a great image. Couple more things here.
Okay.
So Jesus is standing at the door and knocking.
Yeah.
And, he liked to tell these stories in the gospel of the master's off on a journey.
Mm-hmm.
He leaves the servants at home or the maids at home. And then in the middle of the night, he's going to come and knock and you better be awake.
Yeah.
But the whole point of that story is the house belongs to the master.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like Jesus is knocking on the door of my house.
Mm-hmm.
It's his house.
Okay.
And the question is, are you going to let him into what is already really his, which is your life?
Mm-hmm.
So there's this idea of a door, and then he says, those who conquer, I will let them sit on the throne with me.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is strategic because, and we'll see this in the next episode next week, and we're actually bringing an expert in the book of Revelation. One of my professors is going to join us. But chapter 4, verse 1, right after this letter, is an important hinge moment in the book.
Okay.
And hinge is an appropriate metaphor there because in chapter 4, right after these 7 letters, he says, I looked, and behold, a door in heaven was open.
Oh, that's it.
Yes. And so he's talking about a door, and then immediately he sees a door in heaven is open.
Uh-huh.
And then what does he see? A throne.
Yeah.
So just as Jesus said, I will have them come sit with me on the throne, in Revelation 4 and 5, we see a vision of the throne room of God, and then Jesus himself gets on as a slaughtered lamb, and we'll go into this in later episodes. Jesus himself is the lion and the lamb who gets upon the throne. Mm-hmm. And so there is a very strategic connection point between how these 7 letters end and how the visionary material starting in chapter 4 and onward begins. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I wrote them down. Can we review how each one of these ends?
Sure.
Okay. So Ephesus, ear to hear, the Ephesus was the tree of life, right? Smyrna was no harm to us being done on the second death. Pergamum, the secret manna, and then the white stone, right? I can't say this one. Thyatira.
That's how I've heard it. I don't know if it's right.
The authority and the morning star. Sardis, the book of life and the white robes. Philadelphia, write the name of God, and then there's New Jerusalem. And then Laodicea, the throne room, next to Jesus in the throne room. Are we going to touch on all, do we see those in the next few chapters of Revelation?
Not in the next few chapters,
but in the book.
They appear systematically at the end of the book.
Okay.
Yes.
So like each of these endings of those letters to each of these churches has purpose in the rest of the book.
100%.
Yeah. It's very cool.
And remember, the way that ancients read, well, first of all, this would have been read aloud. Most people are hearing it, and it would be in one sitting.
Right.
So that, this is a common artistic technique. Pastors do this, writers do this, that when you start a speech or you start, kind of loop around at the end to where you began to provide this sense of closure.
Yeah.
Revelation very much does that, and it rewards us as readers if we sit down and read it in one shot. Because then you just, your short-term memory is populated with like the stuff you need to be able to say, boom.
I just heard that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not that hard, actually.
Yeah.
Like I don't nearly as much as I should read for length like that. But whenever I do, I'm like, dude, this stuff is transparent. Like the patterns are not, the Easter eggs are not hidden all that well.
Yeah.
And so it's a good thing to read that way.
It is. I even with preparing for this was able to read the whole thing in, I don't know, it was a couple hours, but I did audio
Good
first.
For you.
Well, I'm not the best reader and processor. Like I have to do it in different ways in order to really grasp what's being said or had. I just have a harder time with it. So I'll do the first pass, just audio. And then I will notice certain things with just listening to the text and then going back and then like reading it again. I'm like, oh, and then you get different layers of understanding and different things kind of pop out. But so that might be helpful if you're in the car and you just have an hour and a half, or it actually didn't even take that long. Just listen to the whole thing. And then maybe the next morning, go back and kind of like reread what you had listened to the day before, and you'll notice stuff. It's cool stuff.
Yeah. And sometimes too, a different translation alongside can bring out, because every translation has to make decisions.
Yes.
And when you highlight one aspect of a word or image, you're maybe muting another aspect.
Sure.
But another translation will choose the other, so it rounds out our approach.
Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah. Well, that was a lot of material
this
that we
was
got
a lot
through
of
today.
Stuff. A lot happening in these 7 churches, but we're going to be hearing more about them as we keep diving into Revelation. So
yes. Yeah. And as we get into the 7 bowls and the 7 trumpets and the 7 seals and so forth, we got to keep in view that this is written to specific churches, specific people. Yes. It's assumed that it's applicable to their life some way. They may not have agreed with what it was saying, but they could at least understand it. So we've got to continue to do the work to have those resonances ready at hand to say, oh, it's maybe mentioning that.
Yeah.
But then after you make that connection, you're not done. The next question is, well, what does that mean? And what does that maybe mean in our world today? So I'm excited. I'm going to learn a bunch of new stuff. I can't wait to study it up. And I'm very excited that in the next episode, I'll have a lot of questions for my professor. I think that'll be really great.
That'll be exciting to hear.
And well, thank you for this.
Of course, thank you.
And guys, thanks for joining. Hope this was worth your time and helpful. We're in the Bay Area in California. Would love to see you sometime. The Bay.Church. You can come to weekend services or join online. And if you'd like, you can support us by clicking like and share and leave a comment and all that fun stuff. Or we also need financial support, honestly, to help our team. We've got some wonderful volunteers, but who also have jobs. And so we'd be very grateful for any financial support. And with that, be well. As the rabbis say, shalomi homies. Take care. Bye-bye.